first came into the Air Force back in the early 60s, Vietnam was just something that people whispered about, that so-and-so got some secret orders and he was going to this place called Vietnam. And as time went on, I learned more and more about what was happening in Vietnam, and the 1954 treaty after Dien Bien Phu, after the French were run out of Indochina, specified that no modern weapons were to be allowed into Southeast Asia. And so, they were fighting the war with propeller-driven airplanes, some of the older airplanes, and the war was more or less being fought with fairly crude weapons. So I figured, I was in a high-tech job, electronic warfare. I didn't think I would ever get involved there. But the war kept escalating a little bit, from a little bit and a little bit more, and then finally President Johnson started bombing North Vietnam, and when he started bombing North Vietnam, the Russians moved surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. We call them SAMs. They were SAM, surface-to-air missile. And they moved those into North Vietnam, and there was some real bright colonel in the Pentagon came up with the idea that what they would do is they bought some special electronic equipment that would home in on the radar system that guides the SAM, and they would put this equipment into an F-100F, which is a two-seated F-100, and put an electronic warfare officer in the back seat to operate that stuff. And they did this for a little while, but it didn't work out very well because the F-100s were too slow to keep up with the F-105s and the F-4s. And so they decided to go to F-105Fs, and they were used those for a while, but the up-and-coming airplane was the F-4. So they discontinued the F-105 program for a little while, and they were going to go to F-4s. Well, they could never make the equipment work in the F-4. So on Halloween in 1966, the commander came by my office and he says, "I want to see you down in my office. I got some orders for you." And he went down there and he had a message, and I was to report, this was on the 31st of October, and I was to report to Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada, and on November the 21st, which was 3 weeks later. And I have the slide up here of this is actually a glacier in Alaska, but anyway, as a token of where all this started was in Duluth, Minnesota, and in the frozen north. So so anyway, I went off to Nellis Air Force Base. We went a very quick training program. Our academics consisted of the first morning we got there. They showed us how the electronic equipment worked, and they showed us how to operate the ejection seat. And that was that was our academics. And so, they took us on 13 flights. We went to the gunnery range, shot the guns, we dropped bombs, and they had some radar simulators that we worked against to simulate the surface-to-air missile radars. And we did all that in 3 weeks, and they sent us off to Southeast Asia. So ended up at Tak Lee, Thailand, and this is the only picture I have of Tak Lee. This was the village, and this is the Buddhist pagoda, and which is, I guess, the same as a church in the Christian faith. And it's the only picture I have of Tak Lee. Was a little village of about 1,500 people. Wasn't a very big place, and they did have a fairly large air base, and then we also had the Thai Air Force there. And there was me sitting in front of the F-105 at Tak Lee, and then this is the F-105F model, and this is a drop tank, a fuel tank that after you burn the fuel in it, you just push a button and it would drop off if you needed to get rid of it, because it made the airplane more maneuverable. We had the Shrike Missile, which is right there. And the Shrike Missile, you could point it to a radar, the radar that guided the missile, and this missile would home in on the radar, so you were shooting back at them. And the thing with that missile, they could see the missile coming on their radar, and as soon as we launched the missile, they would shut their radar down, and so that effectively would stop their capability of being able to shoot at us. If their radar wasn't on, they couldn't guide the missile. So that was quite effective in that way. And in addition to that, we had a cluster bomb, which this bomb was just what it consists of is a canister, and inside that canister are 720 bomblets about the size of a baseball. And they were similar to a hand grenade. They had a cast iron casing, and embedded in that cast iron were about 3/8 inch ball bearings. And these ball bearings, when these things went off, supposedly had enough velocity that they would penetrate the engine block on a truck. And we dropped, if we could find a SAM site, we would drop the bombs on it, and if you took out one missile, the explosion from that would take out the rest of the site, because the technical limitations of the missile system were that they all had to be within 150 feet or so of the control van. So they had all of missiles sitting right around that control van, and if you got one missile, you took the whole system out. And we had the same on the other wing. We had 2 Shrike missiles, and we had 2 of the bombs. So we usually flew in flights of 4. And what we would do is we had, now this airplane right here is a D model, which is a single seat, just had a pilot in it. And sometimes we would have 2 of the F models and 2 of the D models, and what we did when the flight of 4, when we got to the target area, we would go in ahead of the main strike force, which consisted of another 20 airplanes coming behind us. We went in 4 minutes ahead of them, and we would split up, and we would have 1 F model and a D model, or if we had 4 F models, 2 F models, but we'd split up. There were 2 airplanes were headed toward the target at one time, and the other one was coming outbound. And so when we got to the target, we would call turning outbound, and then the other 2 would turn back inbound. So we always had those missiles pointed at the target and where the SAMs were. And so that's essentially the way we did the mission. And we went in 4 minutes ahead of the first strike flight, and we stayed there until 1 minute after the last one was off target. And so that put us orbiting the target site for 10 minutes, which when you're being shot at is an eternity. Seems like it's forever. On our way to North Vietnam, we would refuel from the 135s, and after we came back out, we would refuel again, get enough fuel so we could make back to the home base. This is the bad guy. This is the SA-2 Guideline missile, the Soviet anti-aircraft missile that we were going after, the ones they put into North Vietnam. It's a 2-stage rocket, and this is the booster stage, and this is the sustainer and the warhead. And they had an area of coverage of looked like a donut, because the booster would fire and it would take the missile out to about 7 miles. And when the booster dropped off, then they could start guiding the missile. And then they had from there to 16 miles was their coverage. And if you were outside that range, the missile would fall off before it got there. And they had a proximity fuse, which would detect when it got close to an airplane and would detonate, or the controller, when he flew it close to the airplane, he could detonate it from the ground. And the radar that we were homing in on was, they called it, our code name for it was the Fansong radar. And this radar, unlike most target tracking radars, could track a target and look for other targets at the same time. Most target tracking radars, when they lock on, that's all they can see is that target that they're locked on to. But this one could do both at the same time, look for new targets and also lock onto a target and guide a missile to it. And this particular radar is on a gunnery range at Nellis Air Force Base out in the desert. So it's not in a jungle environment. This is North Vietnam. For those of you that hear about the Vietnam War, most of it happened down here, which is off the map. I have never been to South Vietnam, flown over it a couple of times, and that's the closest I've ever gotten to it. I was stationed in Thailand, and we bombed in North Vietnam, and I spent 6 years there after getting shot down, but had never been to South Vietnam. The day that I was shot down, our target was a power switching switch yard, instead of like the ones you see around here or just sitting out in the open. This one happened to be inside a building, and it had a dirt revetment around the building. And we had bombed this target a couple of times before and had never been able to hit that little building in the inside of that dirt revetment. And so there was a big push on to get in there and knock out that target that day. And we got to the beginning of what we call Thud Ridge, which was a ridge ran down to Hanoi right here. And we would fly down that ridge. And if they fired a missile at us, we could duck to one side or we could duck to the other side of that ridge, and made it real handy. And then, therefore, they called it Thud Ridge, which the nickname for the F-105 was Thud. The reason they called it the Thud was when they first came out, there's so many of them crashed that the pilot said it hit the ground with a thud. And so, even the company, they put out a book after we got back from Vietnam, Republic Aircraft put out a book, and the title of the book was Thud. They finally called it that too. The official name of it was the F-105 Thunder Chief. But anyway, that's what we call it. So we were going down, started down Thud Ridge, and we called back to the mission commander. He was in the first strike flight, and told him that there was a cloud cover over Thud Ridge. And we were at 18,000 feet over the clouds. And he said, well, go ahead and look, see if there's a hole over Hanoi so we can get in there and bomb. And that was a no-no. We usually flew at 5,000 feet where you could get down to the ground and get away from the missiles. So anyway, my memory is not very good about what happened. I remember that, and I remember looking out of the airplane, and I remember the missile coming out of the clouds, and about the time it came out of the clouds, it detonated right above the airplane. And this missile had a 500-pound warhead, so if you were within 1,500 feet of that missile, it's probably going to get you. And I remember the fire, and I remember all the holes that were punched in my canopy, and there was so much fire in the cockpit that I couldn't see the instrument panel. And that's the last thing I remember. I don't remember pulling the handles and firing the seat or anything like that. And later on that night, I woke up in a bamboo hut with no clothes on and a bunch of screaming Vietnamese, and they were spitting on me. They were hitting me with their fists. I had a big gash across the back of my head. I had cuts and burns and bruises all over my body, and I had a broken leg. And they were twisting my broken leg, and we were having quite a ball doing that. So anyway, you know, I was there, and they took me outside for like a pep rally, and they had all the people in the village out there, and they were quite vicious. And then it started raining. They took me back into the building, and they kept beating on me and whatnot. And then later on that night, the Army came to pick me up, and they put me on a bamboo stretcher, and they carried me for a long time, and I was conscious and unconscious and whatnot. And we finally got to a place where there was a truck, and they put me in the back of a truck, or a vehicle similar to a Jeep. and there was not enough room in there for me to lay out completely in the bed of this thing, so my leg was sticking out the back of this truck. And we started off down the road, and it was a very rough road, and bouncing up and down with a broken leg was very painful. And when we got to a village, they would stop, and the driver had a bullhorn, and he would get up on the hood of the truck, and he'd whip the crowd into a real frenzy, and they would beat on me, they would twist my broken leg, pull on it, and they just loved to hear me scream. And sometimes they would get so vicious that there was a guard sitting in the back of this truck with me, and he would be so worried about those people getting him too, that he would take his rifle and he would hit them over the head with that rifle. He would threaten to shoot. He would jab them with the bayonet, and so on, to get them to back up. And so we did this all that night, and then the next day we got to a village somewhere, and they put a cast on my leg in this village, and I met a doctor, and he looked a lot like Bob Barker. He was a white man. He wasn't Oriental, and I was told later that he was a Swedish doctor, and he's the one that put the cast on there, and he told me that he had connections to the International Red Cross, and he could get a letter out for me. And at that time, I didn't think I was going to live anyway, so I didn't really care about a letter. And he wanted to talk about what kind of airplane I was flying. I wouldn't tell him, and he got mad at me. So much for being able to write a letter. We finally got to Hanoi. This is downtown Hanoi, and this big white building is the Ministry of Justice, and this is Wallow Prison, and that's what we call the Hanoi Hilton. And I have a little bit bigger picture of that. When I arrived there, this area right here was what we call New Guy Village, and that's where they brought the new people that they had just captured. They brought them in there, did the interrogations, and when I was there, they threw me on the floor in this room, and they had all these hooks and leg irons and stuff laying around, and I at the time didn't understand what they were all about. But I had a cast that went from here to the bottom of my foot, and they tried to fool with me, and I'd pass out, and so they kept telling me that if I didn't talk to them, that I wouldn't get any medical care, and I needed medical care, otherwise I was going to die. So eventually I decided, well, I'll talk to them, and I decided that they had more F-105 pilots than they did EWOs, so I was going to tell them I was a pilot. And so I just started talking to him. He asked me what kind of airplane I was flying in. Told him F-105, and then he wanted to know D model or F model. And I told him a D model. And he says, "You're lying to me because you were flying in an F model." And he says, we just talked to your pilot, Major Dudash, and we know that you're an EWO. And so, okay, so much for that one. And the real important thing that they wanted to know, what were the targets? Well, we did not get the targets until the night before, so had no idea what the targets were going to be. And so, they kept pushing. I made up some, and I told them, one of them was the docks in Haiphong, and he says, that's Navy operational area. That's 6 Bravo. He says, the Air Force bombs in 6 Alpha. And so, anyway, we went on about that, and then he wanted to know the names of the people in my squadron. I made up a bunch of names, and then he read off a list of the roster of the squadron, and he says, "What about these people?" I said, "Oh yeah, they're still there too." So, and beyond that, they really weren't interested in any other intelligence, as far as technical stuff and so on. Apparently, they were not capable of handling that type of information. And so after that, the interrogation turned into the political end of it. And they wanted to know who I was related to. Was I related to any congressman or, important people? What did my father do? How much money did my father have? Things like that was what they were more interested in than anything else. And they didn't even understand that. always told him my father was a farmer, but I always changed the story about how much land he had and all that stuff. And you know, we went through, and he had so many tractors and so many plows and so many combines and so on. And then the interrogator asked me, he says, well, are there any assets such as buffalo? And to him, the only thing that was an asset was that water buffalo to pull that plow. He didn't understand all the rest of it. So anyway, well, this is, they did not do this to me. They did that to a lot of the people. When they brought them in, they would tie their elbows and their wrists together behind their back and then pull their arms up over their head and leave them that way for about 15 minutes. And they would, after 15 minutes, they would release the ropes to restore circulation because after a while you'd go numb, and if you didn't feel any pain, it didn't help. And as far as I know, the record was the most of those rope tricks that anyone went through before they started talking was 5, and most of them started talking after 1 or 2. So it was very painful, and you know, they talk about what happened at Abu Ghraib and the stuff that's happening at Guantanamo. That's nothing compared to this type of stuff. And they had other torture techniques too, where they would they didn't do the waterboarding. Well, I think there were a few people that experienced something similar to that, but you know, mostly they used the rope trick to get people to do what they wanted to do. The next stop was Heartbreak Hotel, and that was in Wallow Prison too. That was another section. It was very appropriately named because after you'd been shot down and brought in and all went through the trauma of the trip into Hanoi, getting beat up by the villagers and so on, in the interrogations, they took you to Heartbreak Hotel. And that's when you had time to think and realize what had really happened to you, and it was a real heartbreaker. And at the foot of the bunks at Heartbreak, they were concrete bunks, and they had these stocks, and they would put people in the stocks there to soften them up. And one of my cellmates, the first cellmate I had, spent 3 weeks in those stocks, and when they opened the stocks to let him out, the skin around his ankles stuck to the stocks. And so anyway, that was Heartbreak Hotel. And then that same prison, there was another section there that we called the Little Vegas, because they had so many F-105 pilots there, and they trained at Nellis Air Force Base in Las Vegas. And so they called that section of the camp the Little Vegas. And they had the buildings named after some of the casinos in Las Vegas. And I moved to the one that was the Golden Nugget. And there were only 3 rooms in the Golden Nugget. I had finally had a cellmate, and they put me in there. Up to this time, I had not had a mosquito net, and the mosquitoes almost carry you off in that area of the world. And probably the nicest thing they ever did for me was give me that mosquito net. Yeah. After a couple of weeks in this place, well, while I was there, they did surgery on, they told me my leg wasn't healing, and they took me out for surgery, and they put a steel pin in my leg. And after the surgery, they took me back to the Little Vegas, and I got a real bad infection in it. My leg ballooned up to about twice normal size, and the medic came, and he ripped the incision back open to let it drain. It drained for 6 months before it finally healed up. So anyway, the steel pin they put in there stayed in there until 1978. After I came home, it came out through the knee, and they removed it. The next place went was the zoo, and this was the prison right here. And this had been a movie studio. And after the Vietnam War, after we left, they went back to being a movie studio. And right here was a swimming pool. And we didn't get to swim in the swimming pool. We dumped our latrine buckets in there, and they raised fish in it. And these water holes right here, those are bomb craters. And that was an ammunition depot. And when they bombed that ammunition depot, I was in this building right here, laying on a concrete floor underneath my bunk, And when they dropped the big 3,000-pound bombs on that ammunition storage area, when they went off, I bounced on that concrete floor. And the doors to my cell were French doors, and they were about 2 inches thick. It was teak wood. Teak is a very hard, strong wood. And those doors are sitting there fluttering like a couple of pieces of paper when the shock waves came through. And the walls cracked and the ceiling came down. And there were secondaries that went off in this ammunition dump all night long. And the Vietnamese were very unhappy. And then some of the people said that some of the cluster bombs had ended up inside the camp and had killed some of the guards. It was the reason they were so mad. And so anyway, I spent 3 years in this camp. And this is what the cells looked like. I was telling you about the big heavy teak doors with the steel straps. They were very crudely made, looked like they'd made with a hammer and an anvil in a blacksmith shop. And but they did have the big bolt, and they locked them. And the rooms were very small. We had our dishes that where they would feed us, and we would come out and pick up our food there after they dished it out. And that was one of the cells looked like. And this was another cell. This was one that I was in later. It was we had 9 people to a cell there, which was in some respects quite fortunate, because there were a lot of people that had been in solitary and had been in solitary for years. And so, except for, I don't know, about 30 or 40 days, I always had cellmates. I only spent that much time in solitary. So anyway, I spent several years in this section, 2 years I spent here. I spent 1 year in the other section of that camp. It was all in the movie studio. Apparently these rooms, when there was a movie studio, they had stored film and chemicals in these rooms, and they had a very elaborate system of vents and whatnot. They had triple walls, and they had a vent system there, I guess, to keep it cool and dry in there, being in a very humid jungle type environment. Okay, this is what our bunks looked like. The bunks, the beds in Vietnam were like tables. They were just a wooden slab. Sometimes we slept on just on the concrete floor, and we had a little rice straw mat that we slept on, and we had 2 blankets. And this is a guy smoking a cigarette. We would get 3 cigarettes a day, and the reason they said that we got 3 cigarettes a day was because Ho Chi Minh was a heavy smoker, and he didn't want to have any prisoners that didn't get to smoke. So, they were being nice to us. They gave us 3 cigarettes a day. And then we got a plate of food, and we got a little jug of water each day. Even the locals in Hanoi didn't drink the water out of the tap. They always boiled it. And so we get boiled water once a day, and we got fed twice a day, which is about 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And if it was cold, and nobody thinks of Hanoi being cold, but it gets very hot there in the summertime, and it gets quite cold in the wintertime, especially if you don't have any clothes to wear. And so, it was from 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 10 o'clock the next morning. When it was cold, that was a long time. You got very hungry before they fed you again. And our food in the summertime, we got pumpkin soup. They would take pumpkins, chop them up in little pieces, and put them in a pot of water and boil them, and we got the soup with the chunks of pumpkin. Or we had green soup, and greens looked sort of like sweet potato vines, or somewhat like mustard greens, I guess. And they would, chop these up, throw them in a pot, boil them, and they fed that to us. And then, in addition to the soup, you would get either a big plate of rice, and it was a plate about that big around, and they mounted high with rice. When I first got there, I could just eat a little bit of that rice. I couldn't eat that whole plate. But when the cold weather came, I could eat that whole plate of rice and then still look for more. So course, in the wintertime, and we also occasionally would get a loaf of French bread instead of the rice. And the POWs preferred the bread to the rice, but we didn't always get the bread. So, and then very seldom you'd get fish. These were, the big dish in Vietnam is nuoc mang. And the way they make that, they take these little fish like smelt, they put them in a crock, and they cover them with soy sauce, and they let them rot, and they smell terrible. And so we would get the scraps that they got after they make the nuoc mang. They would drink the liquid that was left. You know, it was a delicacy in Vietnam, and you see it on some menus here, but I don't think it's the real stuff, because if they had it in a restaurant here, everybody would leave. It smells that bad. So anyway, we would get that. Then in the wintertime, they would feed us kohlrabi soup or cabbage soup. And kohlrabi is sort of similar to a turnip, except that the bulb grows above ground. I knew what it was because my mother used to grow kohlrabi in the garden, but when she made it, it tasted a lot better than what that stuff tasted like. So anyway, that was the food that we ate. We were, in these cells, we were isolated from each other. And they didn't want us to talk to each other or communicate with each other. And if they caught you talking to another cell or communicating with them, they would take you out and you'd get a severe beating or whatever, or they would lock you up in leg irons for a couple of weeks and so on. But anyway, we had a communication system, and we tapped on the walls and communicated with each other. And the way that worked was you had a 5x5 matrix, you eliminate it to K, and anytime that you had a word that used K, you used C instead of K. And so the first set of taps would be the row, and the second set of taps would be the column. And so like an A would be 1, 1, or Z would be 5, 5. You know, 5 taps and 5 taps. And this is not as efficient as Morse code, but you could tap it through the wall, and it was much easier for people to learn, even though we were supposed to know Morse code. Not many people knew Morse code well enough to be able to communicate with it. So, and you have a hard time tapping Morse code through a wall. And in addition to tapping on the walls to each other, they would take us out to work. And one of the things they made us do was pull weeds in the camp, and then after we pulled the weeds, they would have us tamp the dirt down, you know, pack it down hard, and with that tamper you make a loud enough noise that it could be heard all over the camp, and that was a great communications device, and it sent a lot of messages that way. And then also they would take us out when the leaves came off the trees. They would have us sweep the leaves up into a pile and had these real stiff bamboo brooms. And they would make a loud scraping noise, and you could scrape out that 5x5 code with the brooms, and a lot of messages were sent that way. So, you know, and in addition to that, you know, well, we tapped, this tapping on the wall, be real quiet, listen with a cup to your ear, and tap through the wall. Same time, you know, if there were more than one person in the cell, one of them or a couple of them had to watch out for guards. And that's what he's doing here, is just peering under the door, watching for guards and so on. And their signal was, if there was a danger, was one cough. And when there was a cough, everybody quit doing what they were doing. And then the all clear was 2 coughs. So when you had 2 coughs, you went back to communicating. So. In addition to that, we had a mute code that somebody came up with, and these were the hand signals to signal the different letters of the alphabet. And if you could see the person, you could send a message using that. And in a lot of places we use that. Another way we sent the 5x5 code is some cases there would be a vent hole at the top of our cell, and they could see way across to another building and take something white and move it in front of that vent hole, and using a 5x5 code, you could send messages that way. And we didn't have anything else to do but sit there all day and come up with these ideas. And so, people came up with some very innovative ways to send messages. In one case, they could see the cell door to one of the cells, and when they let them out in the courtyard to wash, they could swing that cell door by the 5x5 system and communicate that way. So they didn't want us to do that. That's how we communicated with each other. There were two, and something that people, when I show them one of the later slides that I have, people say, you were in this big room, why did you have to do all that communicating? Well, we weren't always in those big rooms. There were two distinct periods of our imprisonment. One was before September of 1969, and summer of 1969 was probably one of the worst summers that we went through in North Vietnam. It was probably the worst treatment. And then all of a sudden in September of 1969, our treatment improved tremendously. It was still not up to the Geneva Convention standards, but it was, compared to what it had been before, was much, much better. They had bricked up all the air vents in their cells, and they knocked the bricks out of the air vents, let us have some fresh air and things like that. They let us write letters home. They let us receive letters from home. They let us receive packages and things like that. They had very strict rules on the letters and the packages. They had to be on a certain form that they approved. Another way we communicate was yelling through the wall. Take a blanket and roll it up like a donut and put your face in it and against the wall. And if you talked in a real high squeaky voice, it carried better through the wall than if you were just talking in a normal voice. And this is what essentially what we were issued. We had the wooden plank to sleep on. Sometimes we just slept on the concrete. Had the straw mat. They gave us a bamboo fan. This was the water jug, a cup, and we had shoes, which were similar to flip-flops. They were made out of rubber tires, and then we had two blankets, and we had to roll up our pajamas and stuff that they had issued us. We had one set of shorts and short sleeve shirts, and then we had one set of, we had two sets of each, and then we had a set of long sleeve and long legged pants. And we had to roll all that up in these bedrolls, and we had a sweatshirt too. And they wanted us to roll them up and make them real square. And in one cell that was in, one of my cellmates, he just sort of put his stuff in there and rolled it up, and it was not very neatly done. And so our turnkey, when there was an inspection coming, he would come and fix his bedroll. And so we always knew when an inspection was coming, we'd hide all our contraband. These were some of the artifacts that people made. We stole matchbox from the Vietnamese. We picked up nails. We swiped razor blades and made needles out of some of the fish bones, and got thread, stripped it from our clothes, and then made dice and poker chips out of bread dough. Just take the bread and knead it together. And they also gave us pepper. And these bread dice or poker chips, the rats were everywhere over there, and the rats would eat it. And I remembered that my father had put red pepper in the combine to keep the rats out of it. And so we used the red pepper, mixed it with that, and the rats wouldn't eat it. So, and like the cross was made out of bread dough. And some people had rosary beads made out of bread dough and things like that. Another thing, we did exercising the first period before 1969. If you got caught exercising, they would beat you up pretty bad because they didn't want us to exercise. We would have lookouts watching for guards, and we do push-ups and run in place and sit-ups and things like that to stay in shape. And then later on, after 1969, they did let us exercise and do things like that, and they didn't punish us when they caught us. Bathing, which this one is rather fancy. This was a camp that was up in the mountains in 1972 when Nixon mined Haiphong Harbor and resumed a bombing. They took 210 of us to a camp that was on the Chinese border, was way up in North Vietnam. We were about 3 miles from the Chinese border, and the mountains in that area go straight up and straight down, similar to the way Al Cap used to draw mountains in his cartoon strip, Dog Patch, and so we called the camp Dog Patch. And so this was at Dog Patch, and those pipes that are coming to those sinks, those were hollowed out bamboo poles, and they were running water from a spring. It was on a mountainside, and it was a strong flowing spring there. And the water from the spring would run through those sinks. And that's what we bathed with. We had a bowl, and we dipped the water out of there and poured it over us. That's how we took a shower. And earlier, they had like horse troughs and the water in them, and we dipped the water out of that and poured it over us to wash and use the water to wash our clothes. We were there until January the 19th of 1973, and then the night of the 19th of January, there were a whole bunch of trucks showed up in the camp, and in the middle of the night they got us up and they put us on those trucks, and we had a trip back to Hanoi. It was about a 2.5-day trip going back. It was only 90 miles, but on the roads that they have there, it took a long time. They took us back to this prison, which incidentally, at one time, all 350 of us were in this section of that prison, and we went back to that. And about a week after that, they came around, and that was when the Paris peace agreement had been made. They read the agreements to us, and we each received a copy of the agreements. And according to these agreements, the sick and wounded were to be released first, and then it was by date of capture. And so we knew what order that we had been captured, and so I was solidly in the middle of the second group. And the first group went home on time on February the 12th, and the date that I was supposed to go home was February 26th. Well, the day came, and that night the camp commander had us lined up out in the courtyard, and he said, today was the day you were supposed to go home, but you're not going home because the United States didn't keep the agreement. And so, morale really dropped. Then about a week later, there were signs that we were going to go home soon. And then on that Saturday night of the 3rd of March, they fed us a good meal, which was fried pork rinds and some rice, which was better than normal. And the next day, they loaded us on the buses. They had given us special clothes to wear to go home. And we went over, put these clothes on. We had a bag with some stuff in it they let us, that they gave us. And they put us on a bus, and we went out to the airport. This is one of the rooms in the big rooms in the Hanoi Hilton in the Wallow prison. So anyway, it was, had concrete bunks down each side and a walkway down the middle. So then, anyway, the 141 showed up, and they had a little release ceremony. We went through that, and there was a colonel, there was an Air Force colonel there, took possession of us. We walked across the line and saluted him, and then there was a captain grabbed my arm and took me over to the airplane, made sure I got on the airplane and didn't get lost on the way. So anyway, got on the airplane. This was the airplane, and a guy from my hometown that was stationed at Clark Air Base took this picture And this is the C-141 taxiing in at Clark Air Base where we got off the airplane. And that's me getting off the airplane, meeting Admiral Naylor. He was the commander of the Pacific Forces at the time. And he greeted all the POWs when we came off. That's coming home.